Morning. Morning, guys. Morning. Okay, well, I have two news. One is good and one is bad. Let me start with the bad one first. Okay, there's no rat. This was supposed to be the bad one. Okay, well, the good one, the rat allotted for today, give you 100% on everyone, okay? So, right. So I could not tell you because I want you to study, okay? So I tricked you. Anyway, but I also got behind in putting the questions, to be honest, so. I know. So, so we'll start with the application, which means we have plenty of time to go through the applications. But before we start with today's application, I think we had two exercises that we missed from last time. We're gonna take care of today. You have a question, Kendra? Okay. So I had to throw out 3 questions and use them as bonus. There is one I'm still debating about. So exactly, just throw it out, right? So they might, get like you might get a point extra. Or, no, I mean there was problems with them. So yes. No, there were bonuses. Okay, because some people were actually doing good on these extra. So yes, it was supposed to be out of 60, not 57. So these 3 questions were given as bonus. Okay. So if you missed one question, then and you got this right, then this will help you. Okay. I think that's the best way you could. Say it again. It is because I threw away 3 questions and used them as bonus. Yes. So basically, if you missed a question or 2 or 3, then these 3, if you got them right, they still could be used to add 2 points. Okay. Well, it can go either way. I'm just kidding. No, it can. Yes. Yeah. There's one question I'm still debating. It's the select all that apply, and some students were saying they could not. Just throw it away. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
So it says out of 57, and then there's a percentage. Is that with the bonus already added, or is that?
Yeah, what you see, so the average you see and the statistics, that's including the bonus and everything, okay? Yeah, but there's only one question that, I'm still thinking about. If I throw it away, for some of you, you might see the difference, okay? But if you missed it, then it won't make a difference. Okay. Any questions about the cat? We will have a review on Monday. We'll go through my questions, okay? So, I know you have exam today, the lab part, so. Okay, any questions about cat or previous lecture? Okay, so we had 2 exercises we want to finish. I actually did not bring the notes from Wednesday, so can I borrow one of yours? Well, actually, I think I might have it in my computer. Hold on. No, I don't. Okay. You have the exercise from last class. Actually, it's okay. Oh, yeah, the black one. And I also need to borrow your notes. Yeah. Is it colored? Color printed? Is it color printed? No. But thank you anyway. Is this your note from last time?
No, this question. This for today.
Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is to correct this figure here. So thanks to John for pointing this out last time. So guys, remember we talked about the impact of the calcium channel. This is not an agonist. It turns out this is an allosteric, a negative allosteric modulator. Okay, so you could correct this in your notes. Okay. So if you still remember the mechanism of how the signal is, propagated, and when it reaches to the end of the neuron, then the calcium works. Calcium channel is released. So these drugs act as a negative allosteric modulator. Okay. Hopefully you still remember what's the negative allosteric modulator. So that's the first thing. I do want you to consider the fact, and this is on you, that these calcium channels are also present in both the inhibitory and excitatory neurons. Okay, so have fun. I mean, fun, not like stress about the exam. Okay. Then the two exercises left were exercise number Okay, so number 5 from last class was talking about the phenytoin. Okay, we know we had too many issues with the phenytoin. Okay, but one of them in particular was its solubility, right? And we agree that phenytoin is a weak acid, right? So what does that mean? Do you want to have the pH to be higher than the pKa or lower if you want it to dissolve better? Higher. Okay. So the pKa for the phenytoin is 8.06 to 8.33. Okay. So then you need the pH to be higher. Now the pH of blood is 7.4. So there is no way you could change the pH of the blood, right? But when we prepare the solution, okay, is it, so in order to dissolve it in the solution, we have to prepare it in a higher pH. So we use buffer to make the pH 11, okay? So at pH 11, the drug can dissolve. And then when we administer it, we give it in small amounts over a long period of time for 2 reasons. First, to prevent any, what do you call it? What was the term you used, John, yesterday? I think Melody also used it. The term we use if you administer something fast.
Oh, I said the equivalent of an embolism.
Yeah.
Because I'm trying to.
Yes. So basically,
give you an embolism.
Yes.
It's not air, but it's.
Yeah. So that's as far as the speed of administering the IV. The second reason is to help it dissolve at the pH of 7.4. Okay. So you give it at smaller amounts. Now, in case you're wondering, how could you dissolve it at pH 7.4? Well, the solubility at pH 7.4 of the drug will be dropped, but you have a large volume of distribution, so you could still give the drug, but in small amounts. But when you have an IV solution, right, the whole amount of drug is, concentrated in a small bag. So for the drug to dissolve in that solution, the pH has to be 11. Do you see the difference? So you control the pH of the IV bag to make it 11 such that the drug is soluble. But then when you administer it to the IV, the pH is 7.4, the drug will be less soluble, but you have a larger volume of distribution, which is the body fluids, the plasma, and then the drug can still dissolve, not as good as we want it to, but it could still be reached to the target site. Make sense? So one way of solving the solubility was the changing of the pH. Another way we talked about yesterday was using the prodrug. What was the prodrug name? Phosphenytoin, okay. So the phosphenytoin has a function group added to it, to the phenytoin. What's the function group? Phosphate, and then once it gets to the blood, the enzyme converts it to? What's the name of the enzyme? Phosphatase, okay. So now if you give the drug through IV directly, do you have to use the phosphenytoin? Why? Say it again.
Because it's phosphorylated.
Okay. Actually, I was trying to use a different example and go back to the example on the exam, but that's a different story. So you could actually give either one. Phosphenytoin would be more soluble, or you could give it orally. Phosphenytoin again would be better than the phenytoin. Okay. Going back to the prodrug example of the enalapril versus enalaprilat, if you give the drug. So enalapril was designed to be more soluble or less soluble? More lipophilic or less lipophilic? More lipophilic, because with the enalaprilat, we had problem of the drug crossing the gut wall, right? So if you give the drug IV, then you're not worried about this problem anymore. So which one would you give, the enalapril or enalaprilat? You'd give the original drug, right? enalaprilat, the active form. Right, I'm confusing you now. Kendra? Okay, so enalaprilat is the prodrug, okay? And enalapril, I'm sorry, it is confusing me. This is the drug, this is the prodrug. Okay, this is inactive. This is active. Okay. Now, why did we have to use the prodrug to help with the lipophilicity? Okay. Remember, we had two issues: solubility, but then we also want the drug to pass the gut wall. And in the case of the enalaprilat, it does not cross the gut wall. Okay. So here, okay. Now, once the prodrug is in the plasma, it's converted to enalaprilat with which enzyme? Esterase. Okay. In fact, the most common approach for designing prodrugs is using an ester and then relying on the esterase. Just, this is like, one of the rules you should know for sure. Okay. So, since we are using prodrug only to bypass the GI, if you give the drug by IV, do you have to worry about? No, we are not worried about passing the GI. So, would you give up enalapril or enalaprilat? Enalaprilat, okay? So when you go through rotations, when you go to the retail pharmacy, you're gonna see enalapril. When you're at the hospital, you're gonna see IV solutions of enalaprilat, okay? Hopefully you'll remember this class, okay? Make sense? Okay. So back to our example, phenytoin. In the case of phenytoin, the problem was with the solubility. So we added the phosphate and then made the drug more soluble. That's the whole thing. I'm gonna visit the phenytoin again, see if I missed anything. And then I'll take questions. I'm sure you have plenty of them. Okay. Okay, one issue also with the phenytoin is the fact that since it's a weak acid, then when it's in the ionized form, it will be negatively charged or positively charged. Weak acids, when they are ionized, are they negatively charged or positively charged? Negative charge, right? And albumin it's a protein, amino acids, but the nature of albumin has more positive charged amino acids. So guess what? Weak acids have high binding affinity to the plasma protein. 90% of the phenytoin will be bound to the plasma protein. So if you take another drug that also binds to plasma protein, what happens? Drug-drug interactions, okay? So this is one of the issues. I think that's all what I need to talk about as far as phenytoin. think there's another issue with the tablet itself should not be exposed to the CO2 because it, CO2 plus H2O will give you, the alkaline phase, and this would cause some degradation to the drug. But this is, manufacturing issues anyway. Okay, questions. I'm sure you have some questions. Questions about what we talked about so far. About phenytoin. Yes, Melody. Yeah. So what do you think? Phosphate, is it it's a polar group or a lipophilic group? Polar. So it increases the solubility. That's why we use it to enhance, the solubility of the drug. Okay. And then once it's in the plasma, there is phosphatase enzymes that will break the phosphate group, bring it back to the phenytoin. Because the phosphoenolate itself is inactive. It's a prodrug. Make it metabolize further, you mean? Well, so I think you're referring to when the drug is more soluble, then it's easily eliminated. And you're right in this case. But that's like after the distribution. So the drug has to be soluble, and then it's distributed, goes through all over the body, and then produce the action. Part of the body that it goes to is the urine, the kidney, and then there, because it's more polar, then it will be eliminated faster. But then we already achieved our pharmacological effect, so it's okay. We want the drug to be eliminated. Yeah, so that's a good point. Right, another question. Yes, sir. How can what? I'm sorry.
Like IV. Why it's a prodrug?
You say why phosphoenolate can be administered as an IV?
Yeah. I mean, because it's better, it's more soluble. Okay, because it can dissolve better in the circulation, and then it's converted to the active form. So there's two ways to fix the solubility problem. One is to have a different pH for the solution bag. Okay, but then once it's in the circulation, it has a different pH, so the solubility will drop. But then with the phosphoenolate, you don't have to adjust the pH, and well, I'm not sure you have to. It might make it more soluble, but it is soluble enough. So then you could actually give it through IV and not worry about causing any clots.
Like when if you inject it directly without the prodrug, I thought that it can dissolve your blood.
Yes, but not as good as phosphoenolate. Okay, so you'll not be able to give the proper dose. Okay. Look, what about intramuscular injection? Can we give phenytoin IM? Why? Because the pH, again, 7.4, but how come we can give it through IV but not through IM? It will cause still necrosis, but there is
I know that no one would give you like phlebitis and stuff. If you got it in a muscle, probably wouldn't be fine.
Right, but I'm talking about solubility. Why is it soluble if you give it IV, or it's okay, it will dissolve IV, but then if you give it IM, then it will crystallize, and then you have it cannot disperse because how much volume do we have if we give it IM?
All of it's right there.
Exactly, and how much volume do you have if you give it IV? Okay.
As long as the speed is slow enough.
Well, yes, but I mean, you have a large volume, so even though the solubility is very bad, you have a large volume, you could still get something dissolved, right? So it's distributed throughout the body, okay? But when you give it IM, it has a small volume, so it's going to accumulate there and then causes side effects, and I mean that side effect will crystallize and all that. But that's actually also goes back to the same idea of how could we put the whole phenytoin in a small bag? Why did we need a higher pH to dissolve it, but we did not worry about the pH once in the plasma? it actually also goes back to the same concept of the eye drops. When we talk about drugs that we want to administer them as eye drops, how many drops can you give in your eye? 1, maximum 2. In fact, 1, and the second one will not stay, right? So the maximum is 1 drop. So imagine if you want to give this much of drug into small drop, then what do you expect the solubility of this drug to be? You want the drug to be highly soluble, okay? Also, if you're not successful, you probably have to give the drug more often. That's why you see eye drops given like sometimes every 2, 3 hours, 4, 6 hours, or okay? So solubility has to do with the concentration of the drug in a certain volume, okay? So when you increase the solubility, then you're able to actually dissolve more of the drug, okay? Make sense? Okay, just keep that in mind. And then of course, there are other factors like temperature. Of course, when you increase the temperature, then you're able to dissolve more, but then that's not applicable in our case, right? You're not gonna heat somebody to dissolve the drug, right? Okay, not funny, I know. Okay, so exercise number 6, advantage of using the carbamazepine versus the oxcarbazepine. Do you guys know the answer for this? Okay. I'm just showing the structure. So what's the advantage of using the oxcarbazepine compared to the carbamazepine? Kendra? Decrease firing? Like what do you mean? Okay, so they both inhibit the neurons, they're both inhibitory, okay? But why is it that carbazepine is preferred over carbazepine? Say it again? Potent? More polar? Okay, I'm not sure about that. But this is the metabolite of carbazepine. That's one of the reasons. Metabolite of carbazepine. Do you know what this group called? Epoxy. You know what this is a sign of? Toxicity. Anytime you have the epoxy group, then it's a sign of toxicity, okay? This one does not have epoxy. This one is metabolized to the hydroxy, which is not toxic. This is one reason. Another reason is, remember when we talked about the auto-induction, right? This one in auto-induce itself, this one does not. Okay? It actually is metabolized through a different enzyme. I mean, it's still the CYP, but a different isozyme, okay? Sure, okay. So this is the carbazepine, okay? Anyway, can you see the mouse? Okay, so carbazepine and oxcarbazepine. There are 2 advantages for the use of the oxcarbazepine. Okay, the first one is carbazepine is metabolized to the epoxy form here. And anytime you have epoxy form, it's a sign of toxicity. Okay, so this is more likely to cause toxic effect. The oxcarbazepine is metabolized to this form here, hydroxy group is added, and it's less toxic. The second reason is the carbamazepine causes autoinduction. The oxcarbazepine does not. Okay, that's it, very simple. Questions about this? Let me take one question about this just in case. Yes, ma'am.
You're saying that oxcarbazepine is the only one that is not
when the oxcarbazepine metabolized, it gives you this product here, which is not toxic. Yes. This one here, when it's metabolized, gives you the epoxy. And as a rule of thumb, anytime you see an epoxy group, then it's a sign of toxicity. Okay. Good question. Well, if you got this, can you raise your hand? I just want to see. Okay, great. And then the last exercise is just a video that you're going to watch and hopefully fill a table. In fact, there's a table there. except there is a typo in one of the table, okay? So some of you cut the typo already. It talks about some of these drugs increase the GABA activity, while in fact it actually does what? I'm sorry, it decreased the GABA activity, while in fact it should increase GABA activity because these are inhibitors, okay? So if you did not catch this in the video, I can screenshot the table and then send it to you. You want to do that? Okay, you always like to give me homework, don't you? Okay. But if I forget, you remind me, okay? Okay. Any questions before we start today's topic? Okay, so let's start with the anti-Parkinson. So the first application, you should be able to find the answers in page, let's see, 2, 3. No, actually. Oh. I just realized I brought the notes, the wrong notes. Anyways, so first exercise talks about the life cycle of dopamine, which is going to be very common to the life cycle we have seen for the norepinephrine. Remember, you know, the drug binds, it goes metabolized, and then reuptake and all that. So, and these are different ways that for us to design drugs, okay, by inhibition, by agonizing the receptor, antagonizing the receptor, inhibiting the metabolism, inhibiting the reuptake. So study the life cycle, okay, and try to find, compare between also the different receptors, the dopamine receptors, and then describe the pathways available. Okay, let's see, you can see that. So is Parkinson caused by increase in dopamine or reduction in dopamine? What causes Parkinson? Is it too much dopamine or less, too little? Too less. So what happens if you get too much dopamine? Huh? Psychosis, which is we're going to talk about on Monday. So when you study today's class, keep in mind the techniques you will need to actually do what? Reduce the dopamine, okay? So it's like a balance, guys. You should have just the right amount of dopamine. If you get less dopamine, you get what? Parkinson, okay? Too much dopamine, you get psychosis. So what do you think the side effect of the anti-Parkinson drugs? Hallucinations, psychosis, and all these effects, okay? What do you think the side effect of the antipsychotic drugs? Parkinson-like syndrome, which is called extrapyramidal syndrome, okay? So people who are on psychotic drugs, they have, side effects. They could, just, not funny, right? But I mean, just keep that in mind. There's a balance because we will use that life cycle again for the dopamine to design drugs to actually decrease the dopamine, okay? Okay, so take your time, and I'm gonna use my random number again to select teams. So be ready to explain to your classmate. Let's set like 5 minutes, but if you need more time, we can add time. So, you have until 9:40. Are you guys ready? You need more time? Okay, so another 3 minutes. Okay, so I assume you guys are ready. So since there is like 3 parts to the question, we could actually have one team do one part, okay, and then the next team do the other. So starting with volunteers, do you have any volunteers? Come on in, yay. Sure, you could use anything more. Yeah.
Okay, so as we all know that VA dopamine does not cross the membrane. So membrane, no, it does not. Okay, so we have to use an alternative, which is the L-tyrosine. Right? Yes. Okay. So then your L-tyrosine
Okay. So this is what she explained, guys. Okay, let me show the reaction here. Okay. Okay, so she's talking about the synthesis phase. Okay, so L-tyrosine as an amino acid, even though it's polar, but as an amino acid, the cells, the brain cells are able to transport them through what kind of transport? Passive or active? Active transport, right? So lipophilic drugs, they pass without any problems, passively. But if it's a polar drug, then it does not pass unless it has some carrier protein that transfer it in, which is the case with the L-tyrosine. Okay, and by the way, the same applies to the L-DOPA, which we will talk about soon. Once it's in the brain, then it's converted to the dopamine. Okay, so this is as far as synthesis. Okay. Now, speaking of that, can you think of ways for Monday's lecture to actually prevent having more dopamine? Block this or that, right? So you could block this enzyme or this enzyme to prevent dopamine. But in our case, we want to enhance the dopamine. Okay, so this is as far as synthesis. There is other ways in the life cycle of the dopamine here. So when the signal, the signal or nerve impulse propagates and reaches to the neuron, in similar way like what we seen last time, it stimulates the release of the calcium channels. Calcium gets in, it stimulates these vessels. So when dopamine is actually synthesized, they are stored inside these vessels, okay? So then it stimulates the vessels to come to the outside in the synaptic cleft. Dopamine is released, and then it can bind to these receptors. Once it binds, then it's metabolized through this step here. Okay, so this shows the metabolism of dopamine. Okay, it has mainly two enzymes. Can you name them? COMT, What's COMT stand for? Catecholamine O methyltransferase. So catecholamine, because this group here is called catecholamine. I mean catechol, and this is amine, so catecholamine. O, because it actually affects one of these oxygen. Methyl, it adds methyl to the oxygen. So catecholamine O methyltransferase. So now you have a methyl group added here, okay? This is one way. Another way is the monoamine oxidase, which converts the amine into an aldehyde, okay? So in our case, since we need more or less of the dopamine with the Parkinson, more of the dopamine, so we will see that inhibiting this enzyme, the monoamine oxidase or the COMT, would actually give us more of the dopamine. Make sense? So this is as far as synthesis and then metabolism. But there is other steps in between based on this figure. So let me actually keep this figure here and see if you can find out methods to enhance, increase the dopamine. Any suggestions? Any ideas? Excellent. So remember, guys, the autoreceptor here. What does the autoreceptor do? Like we saw previously with the norepinephrine and acetylcholine. What do? They inhibit the synthesis. See the negative sign here. They inhibit, in our case, inhibit the synthesis of the tyrosine, and they also inhibit the fusion of this vessel with the membrane to release dopamine. So if we block this, so D2 antagonist, then we could actually do what? Inhibit the inhibition of the synthesis. So basically, you'll have more of dopamine being released. That's one way, okay? What else? But I want to point out something. Notice that this is D2 and this is also D2. This is presynaptic. This is postsynaptic. So you want to be careful. When you design an antagonist for the D2, you should target the presynaptic, okay? All right, what else? Other mechanisms? What is this one here doing? The reuptake. It's called DAT, dopamine transporter. It transports the dopamine back inside. So what happens if we block this transporter? You have more dopamine in here. Okay? Make sense, guys? Similar to what we have seen in the norepinephrine. If you have any, we should, that should be clear, I hope. Okay, so this I think covers part A, which is synthesis, storage, release, metabolism, and the control by the autoreceptors. Okay, so the next part is comparing between the different types of receptors. Do I have volunteers or should I use my random number? Choose? I should, right? Yeah, okay. Huh. Let's do it. Did you say choose? No? You guys want to volunteer? Yeah, come on in. Team number 10, yay! So you're gonna compare between the different types of dopamine receptors, okay? Okay.
Okay, thank you. I can hold it. Start now. Want me to wait? Okay. So for B, we said that there are 5 subtypes D1 to D5. The D1 family includes D1 and D5, and the D2 family includes D2, D3, and D4 receptors. So the activation of the D1 family, it stimulates the formation of cyclic AMP, which can lead to an inducing of an action potential. So the D2 family, it inhibits the stimulation of the cyclic AMP and suppresses the calcium +2 currents and activates receptor operated K+ currents. So it does not stimulate an action potential. Oh, I'm sorry.
Great. Guys, want to add something else? Or is it? Okay. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you. Okay, so we have two different families, right? One of them is stimulates the synthesis of cyclic AMP, which is just one of the signal transduction process leading to activation, and then the other one is inhibition. So what receptors belong to the first family? D1, D1 and 5. And the second family, 2, 3, 4. Okay. So which one do you think we should target? Which receptors do you think we should target? Should we target D1 family, the stimulates, or D2, 3, 4? Huh? Oh, for Parkinson. Yeah, for Parkinson. So the theory says we target D1, right? Okay, clinical studies shows that when you target D2, you still get anti-Parkinson effect. Yeah, it just confuse you more, right? And that's no surprise. We will see many times where, basic sciences, we try to rationalize things, but then when you do things experimentally, you might be surprised by the outcomes. And this happens all the time. That's why we still have problems. That's why all the diseases are not solved yet, right? Because if we understand everything, then, that's it. Yes, ma'am. Right, so I'm saying we should, based on this theory, I'm saying that we should target the D1 receptor, okay? And this is the hypothesis they used. Yet, later on, as they were testing the drugs that bind to the D2 receptor, they will actually found that, targeting D1, 2, or 3, okay, but like mainly D2 was also giving them anti-Parkinson effect. Clinical studies have shown that. Okay, yes, ma'am. If you target D1 or 5, then it stimulates the message to move forward. Okay, so it stimulates the cyclic AMP, and it's like having more dopaminergic effect. Okay. Say it again. If you inhibit D2, you want to inhibit. Okay, so if you antagonize D2 in theory, then you should have stimulation, right? But remember, D2 is also present as an autoreceptor. Okay, so if you target D2 and you're targeting the D2 at presynaptic, then you have more of the dopamine. But this dopamine will bind to all kinds of receptors: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you target the D2 post-synaptically, the one here, then you're inhibiting the signal transduction process. Let me say this again. How would you choose? That's a very good question. It's hard. You can actually tell, because once the drug gets here, how do you know if it's going to bind to D2 or so it's missing. So in theory, I'm just explaining. In theory, this is what happens. But when you design drugs, you're really not sure which one is we're not sure which one is going to bind to. Not only that, to make things even more complicated, these receptors, from the outside, they look the same. But from the inside, they have different functions that could be opposing each other. So you might have the same receptor from outside, the drug can bind to the same receptor, but from inside, it's doing a different function. That's why you have the multifunctional feature of these dopamine receptors. Believe it or not, dopamine is one of the most challenging type of receptors you can ever deal with. It's, many drugs act as an agonist on one of them, antagonist as another, inverse, and it's only clinical studies that have been, our final decision on whether a drug is going to work or not. We try to hypothesize and come up with explanations, and sometimes it works, sometimes it does not, but we test experimentally on, first in animals and then human to find out whether a drug is work or not. Yes, Melody. Atropine. Okay, so let's first address the first issue. Dopamine by itself is not going to cross the blood-brain barrier. Okay, the L-levodopamine, the L form, the L-dopa, will cross, not because it's lipophilic. It's actually more polar, but it will cross the blood-brain barrier because it has an active protein transport. There's a protein that recognizes the L-dopa and gets it in the cell, but it does not let this happen to the dopamine. Okay. Now, I'm not sure about the second part of the question. No, what I meant when I meant why is dopamine is complicated, because first, we are not sure how each receptor is involved in the pathophysiology, and second, some receptors, from outside they look the same. So like D2, you might target it, but then from inside, instead of doing inhibitory, it might do excitatory. Okay, so it's hard to select the function. So you might select the receptor, but then you don't know what's going to happen as far as function. So, and we don't have drugs that are functionally selective. Okay, what else? Which is why we still have, Parkinson not being successfully treated, which is why the antipsychotic medications are horrible with these horrible side effects. I mean, we're not able to find, good drugs to treat psychosis. Okay, so dopamine is very difficult, receptor to rationalize and design drugs for. Okay, I wanted to bring this to you, ask you which one you think you should target, because in theory, yes, you should target D1, but then as you read the notes, you will notice that there are actually studies have shown that targeting D2 helps also with anti-Parkinson. Okay. Besides, if you think about it, when dopamine is released, it actually binds to both receptors, right? So when you have no dopamine, so I mean, in theory, they should cancel each other and then have no effect, but no. I mean, when you have dopamine, it can bind to both. So really, when you target D2 or D1, you still get the antipsychotic effects. Okay, I mean, anti-Parkinson, I'm sorry, anti-Parkinson. Hopefully I won't make mistakes between these two lectures. So actually, the newer drugs target D2, yes, ma'am. Okay, but we will talk about the problem with this. No, not here. I mean, never mind. We'll compare about the L-dopa. What's the negative, the pros and cons of using the levodopa in the next exercise. So questions so far before we talk about part C of this exercise? Questions? We're going to see another contradicting fact when you predict something, but then clinical studies shows something else in today's class. So be ready to be confused. Okay. Okay, no questions? All right, can you raise your hand if you get this 100%? Okay. Let me take one question just in case. Those who did not raise their hands. So we understand the life cycle of the dopamine: synthesis, storage, release, metabolism, and then you could affect any of these steps to increase or decrease the dopamine, right? And then recently we said, in theory, we should target D1 type receptors, but then studies have shown that D2, targeting D2 also causes anti-Parkinson effect. That's all. Okay, well, I'm gonna move to the next one if we have no questions. Okay, so part C, who's gonna explain the different pathways, the dopaminergic pathways? Yes, yay, team number 7. Okay, thank you so much. You have, oh, I'm sorry, you have one. I'm sorry. Yeah. Yes, which one? Thank you so much. You're very welcome. Okay, so just like Kinder said, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 different pathways. Okay, I'm not worried about where they start, where they end, all these pathophysiologic terms that I cannot pronounce. I'm just gonna point and say this one here, okay, this line here is actually 75% of the dopamine receptor are found in this pathway, and this is the pathway that is believed to be responsible, you know, for the Parkinson effect. Okay, so the pathway here is responsible for effects like movements, you know, tardive dyskinesia, which is the stiffness of the muscles, and of course the other pathways. The mesocortical pathway is responsible for motivation, emotional response, and then mesolimbic is the fun part, pleasure and reward behaviors. And then there is one part responsible for the regulation of the prolactin. That has to do with the hypothalamus. Yes, Melody. Yeah, this one, the nigrostriata. No, I'm saying that's the pathway that actually has, that's the pathway that is, you know, affecting the Parkinson disease. So by targeting receptors in this pathway, we get anti-Parkinson effect. Okay. Now, problem is, it's hard again to select drugs to target one pathway but not the other. So you will see many of the side effects because of the drugs targeting other pathways. Okay. So again, selectivity inside, you know, the brain is another challenge that makes things even more and more complicated. Okay. Okay, and then the next exercise talks about the role of monoamine oxidase in neurotoxicity, and then part B discuss the impact of cigarette smoking, caffeine consumption on developing Parkinson's disease, and then different mechanism of therapy for Parkinson, which one might be neuroprotective. In fact, we already talked about different mechanisms of neurotherapy, but which one is neuroprotective and how clinical studies think about this theory. So I think that should not take more than 5 minutes. So at 10:15, do you need a break? Yes. Okay, 7 minutes break. Well, next time you need a break, guys, seriously, if you need a break, please let me know. Or just say, I'll do this, okay? Because I forget sometimes. Just tell me you need time out or break. How's it going?
Okay.
Okay, so exercise number 2. Let's take 5 minutes. At 10:25, we'll start calling on teams to explain exercise number 5, exercise number 2, okay? So explain the rule of monoamine oxidase and neurotoxicity, and then talk about the cigarette smoke and all that. And also, yeah, so ABC. Okay. So I just want to say something. I just want to say one thing about the cat, guys. So, you know, I had to enter like 65 students, your answers to the exam soft one by one. I did my best, okay? But when we visit, you know, the questions again on Monday, if you are not sure or you think you missed something, you know, you're welcome to come and see your paper, see your answers, make sure that they were entered correctly, okay? I mean, it was a nightmare, but still, you know, I do not want to discourage you from coming. And if you think that you should be, you know, your answers are not correct or something, then stop by. Unless I have the whole class coming in, then that'll be a problem. So anyway, if you are not sure about, you think you should be receiving better grades, you're welcome to come and see your answers and compare it with what I entered in the computer, okay? Okay, so you guys ready? Okay, I assume you guys are ready. I know I had, which you guys want to volunteer? Because I had a team that picked part A. So do you want to do part? You wanted A too? Okay, we can have both explain A. How's that? Yeah, okay, so team number 11 and team number 13. So come on in, both teams. Yay. Yeah. Oh, do you want me to bring the mic here, or are you gonna use the Ducky cam? No? Are you guys shy? All right. So
I can do. All right. So we're doing the A. All right. So the breakdown of dopamine, we produce hydrogen peroxide. Now this hydrogen peroxide is oxidized to hydroxyl group that is really cytotoxic. Now that's how the neurotoxicity happens.
thank you so much. So he was talking about this figure. Thank you, guys. So he was talking about figure number 5. So look at the figure there, and you'll see that there are some reactions coming from the dopamine that will cause some free radicals that causes toxicity. In fact, this is one of the theories why they wanted to avoid using the dopamine agonists, okay? Because it could actually increase the neuronal death, okay? So this is, again, a theory. All right, you guys wanted to explain part A as well, right? Okay, come on in. You want to do it here or at Ducky Cam? Okay.
Just like what they mentioned, right? The NAO, we could actually have it catalyze the oxidation of DA, which is dopamine. So when that happens, that could bring about that cytotoxic, the hydroxyl, the cytotoxic one. So that's why that could be a problem if we have that. And that's actually the one that's the radical in the equation you showed. I was about pointing out that. So that's the problem with it.
Excellent. So actually this works good because one team explained the mechanism of toxicity for the dopamine agonists, and the other team explained how the monoamine oxidase is involved in producing toxic products. So we have the monoamine oxidase here, which is one of the enzymes that causes production of toxic chemicals that leads to the cell death. Among this, if you inhibit, I mean, within this pathway, if you inhibit this enzyme and if you inhibit the reuptake of this inside the cell, then you can protect the cell death, okay? So these are theories that shows that using monoamine oxidase inhibitors, which was one of the mechanisms for anti-Parkinson, right? One of the classes of drugs was the monoamine oxidase inhibitors. So using these inhibitors in theory should reduce the cell death, right? Now the surprise is that clinical studies have shown that there's no like significant, there's no evidence that correlates with this hypothesis. Okay, so this is the shock and the news number 2 today. Okay, makes sense, guys? Questions? So what about cigarette smoking? What does the parts that other than nicotine do? They also inhibit the monoamine oxidase, right? So they were expecting that, you know, if you live long enough and you don't die from lung cancer, then you don't have to worry about the, you know, Parkinson. Okay.
It also reduces Parkinson's if you like don't live long enough to get Parkinson's.
Yeah, that's true. If you die, still you don't get Parkinson, right? So you won both ways. So yeah, great. But again, as far as the monoamine oxidase inhibitors, as you know, the theory that monoamine oxidase inhibitors can protect the neurons from the death has not been proved. Okay, clinical studies cannot show any, you know, strong evidence. I mean, we have this basic science showing that, you know, this enzyme is involved in, you know, moving this reaction forward and causing cell death, but then there's something else we are missing. Okay. Let's see. So, all right, questions about this exercise? Let me take a few questions just in case before we move to the next one. Questions? Yes. Okay, right. Okay, so first of all, as far as nicotine, there is contradicting results, contradicting studies saying that nicotine helps or nicotine does not. The part of the cigarette smoking that inhibits the monoamine oxidase is not actually the nicotine, it's the tobacco in there, okay? It's the it's other ingredients other than nicotine that actually causes the inhibition of the monoamine oxidase. Now, as far as caffeine, it's believed that caffeine reduces Parkinson, okay, through one of the mechanisms, which is the A1, A2 pathway. So there's a receptor called adenosine 1, adenosine T receptor. And by antagonizing this receptor, somehow it leads to reduction of the Parkinson disease, okay? So as soon as we finish, you go, you smoke a cigarette and you drink coffee and then enjoy your life. We're not going to talk about alcohol today, though, okay? Seat belts? I'm not sure about that. But maybe memorizing to wear your seat belts help, right? Yeah, you're right. Why did I even say that? Anyway. Okay, since you have no questions, I assume you mastered exercise number 2 as well. So let's talk about exercise number 3. So in exercise number 3, I'm sorry? 2C. Oh, 2C, I thought we covered this already. So exercise number 2. Oh, so the different mechanisms of Parkinson, so this is, we talked about when you talk about the life cycle of the dopamine. So different mechanisms of treating Parkinson. One of them is monoamine oxidase inhibitor, the COMT inhibitor, the dopamine 2 autoreceptor agonists, okay, which we mentioned when we talked about the life cycle. Are you guys with me? Okay, so we talked about, someone was concerned about part C, different mechanisms of treating Parkinson. We talked about this when we saw the life cycle for the dopamine, okay? When we talk about how dopamine is released, metabolized, stored, and all that. So different ways of increasing the dopamine would be blocking its metabolism is one way. Another way is you could synthesize agonists, which is challenging, okay? You could look at the dopamine, try to, synthesize something that is similar to the dopamine and then do the same thing. In fact, there are 2 natural products, ergotamine and apomorphine, that are similar in structure to dopamine, and they produce dopaminergic effects. So they are actually used as anti-Parkinson. We will talk about these two in one of these exercises, okay? Because we want to compare the structure of these two with the dopamine. Okay, so which ones do you think, which ones of these mechanisms do you expect that in theory they should have a neuroprotective effect? The monoamine oxidase inhibitors, right? So this is the theory, although the studies have not shown that. Okay, that's a good one. So looks like we're trying to come up with questions now. So let me see if you, are we clear? Okay, all right. So exercise number, yes, ma'am. No, actually, dopamine agonists based on this mechanism. So dopamine itself and anything that increases dopamine can actually cause production of these radicals and cell death. So it's not neuroprotective. Okay, so that's why you know, the preferred ways is to use monoamine oxidase, because first, you're not giving any additional dopamine agonists, and second, it's believed to cause to protect the cell death. There's another reason which we'll talk about in exercise number 3. Okay, that has to do with the mechanism of the levodopa versus monoamine oxidase inhibitor. Good, that's a very good question. Other questions? I was actually expecting more challenging questions, because when I was reading the material myself, a lot of things just sound contradicting. So I was coming into the class, I'm like, oh, they're gonna smash me with these questions. It's like, how could you say dopamine causes neuronal cell death, and at the same time you're giving dopamine, right? And they're like, yeah.
We don't know, we think, and sometimes it works. So
Yeah. So this is one of
like they don't know, so how can
right. So many, yeah. So it's actually Parkinson. That's how we still don't have good drug for it, and the same with the antipsychotics. So understanding the dopamine receptors and their physiology, how they work, is really difficult. Well, at least I'm not embarrassing myself so far. No questions? Melody. Yes. Yeah, that's a good question. So we just, we learn the basics, okay, and we try to apply them. Sometimes we're able to explain what's happening, sometimes we're not. This is just part of reality and science, okay? I mean, it doesn't hurt to learn, because if another theory comes out and we could explain things better, then we can use it. If, these theories, we could, maybe find that they actually work, then, so. We have many options, but there's no one good drug that we is the best to use. In fact, we will see that earlier it's good to start with the L-DOPA, but then later on we have to switch to the MO inhibitors. But then there is these new drugs, the D2 agonist, antagonist. But to be honest with you, also the clinical part of this should be covered in better way, and you should be able to know what's the first line of treatment, which one you should start with, depending on the patient case, and all these issues, all these things you will learn in the clinical. So guys, my job here is to teach you the basics. I try my best to connect that to the clinical, but I'm not specialized. I'm not a clinician. Okay, I cannot, answer like what's the best option in this case or that case, because there are guidelines that clinicians follow. Okay, clinician and doctors, they have guidelines they follow based on the age of the patient, the type of the the cause or genetics. So based on these guidelines, they go with what's the best medication. Also, it depends on what if the patient has other diseases or other drugs that he's taking. Okay, so eventually someone from the clinical department will come and teach you in later sessions about all these drugs again, and then what's the best way of choosing the best drug for this case or that case. Okay, that's a good question. Yeah.
So one of the following challenges here would be that people are, by the time people find out they have Parkinson's, they have so many receptors destroyed. Is that right?
Actually, it says you're not that the effect, the Parkinson effect, you do not see until at least like 65 to 80%. I think someone was pointing out in the reading that it was 65. There was confusion which one is the right. So anyway, so when the majority of these receptors are dead, then when you start getting Parkinson, okay? And then normally they start with the L-DOPA, but the problem with the L-DOPA is, we'll talk about this in the next class. All right. Ready? Okay. So exercise number 3, go ahead and look at these parts. We'll talk about, why is L-DOPA is used instead of dopamine. We already answered this question actually, so we could skip that if you want to. But then discuss the advantage. Why do we combine carbidopa? Okay, you've heard of the drug Seniment. Okay, it's a combination of both carbidopa and levodopa. Okay, and then the advantage of using other drugs over L-DOPA, and then how can we tell? So dopamine is very flexible. It has one of the single bonds that causes different conformations, and then one of these conformations, cis and trans, it turns out one is more active than the other. How did we find out that it is the active one? Because so far we do not know how the receptor of the dopamine looks like. Okay, we do not have experimental studies to show us how the dopamine binds to its receptor. I mean, as far as I know, unless something came out like recently. So anyway, so let's say at 10:50 we'll start discussing. If you need more time, we can always add time. Right. Okay, are you guys ready? Do I have any volunteers? Random number? 3. Exercise number 3. Yeah, and we already talked about part A, so we're gonna skip that. But just to be sure, so why do we use L-dopa instead of dopamine? Why not giving dopamine instead of dopamine? Does not cross the blood-brain barrier. L-dopa does. Which one is more polar? L-dopa is more polar, right? So how does it cross the blood-brain barrier then? Active transport. Okay. Okay. Part B. Discuss the advantages of combining carbidopa. Why do any volunteers, guys? Okay, I'm gonna be mean then. No, not yet. 18, yay! You can do it. Yeah, exercise number 3. So if you could just explain to us why do we combine carbidopa with levodopa, okay?
Okay, combining them is actually the most effective therapy for controlling DA motor symptoms, and also combining them it inhibits the decarboxylation. So this allows more L-dopa to reach the brain for the conversion of the DA.
Excellent. Do you guys have anything else to say? Thank you so much. Okay, so it's more efficient. It prevents the decarboxylation of the L-dopa in the peripheral. Okay. So first of all, the levodopamine has to be decarboxylated to become dopamine, right? Right. So then carbidopa is another drug that is just like levodopa, is decarboxylated to something, but it actually keeps the enzymes busy, right? It binds strongly to the enzyme, so it prevents the enzyme from decarboxylating the L-dopa. And excellent, now we have no dopamine, we only have levodopa remaining, right? This is what we want, right? Do you guys agree with me? So we have no dopamine, so, but I thought we needed to add more dopamine in our body, right? To treat Parkinson. So something is missing. Yes. Right, so the carbidopa and levodopa, they are both decarboxylated, okay? But carbidopa has a stronger binding affinity to the enzyme, so it keeps the enzyme busy, right? So the enzyme now is not able to decarboxylate the levodopa. So now we end up with levodopa, but we do need the enzyme to convert the levodopa to the dopamine, right? So what's going on? Something is missing.
Does carbidopa cross, or does carbidopa remain in the periphery so that when levodopa gets there, it's alone to be decarboxylated?
That's a good. This is the part missing. And so what John is asking is, does carbidopa cross the blood-brain barrier to the brain, or does it stay outside? And that's the trick. Carbidopa, what do you think? It does not cross the blood-brain barrier. Levodopa does cross the blood-brain barrier. Okay, so when you combine these two together, the carbidopa will prevent the conversion of levodopa to dopamine, but where? In the peripheral, outside the brain. Okay? But when levodopa crosses the blood-brain barrier, in the brain, it will be converted to dopamine. This way, this works perfect because dopamine then will work only in the brain, not in the peripheral. Okay? So as a result of this, which one will we have less side effect? Combination of levo and carbidopa or just using levodopa? Combination will have less side effects, okay? Now, if we do not combine the carbidopa and if the levodopa stays in the peripheral, it's converted to dopamine, then dopamine will bind to other parts of the body causing side effects, like, for example, in the GI, it causes nausea and vomiting. In the kidney, it would cause hypotension. In the peripheral vessels, it causes vasoconstriction. So you have, hypertension and hypotension. So some contradicting effects indeed, but still, these one of the effects of dopamine. And on the heart, it causes tachycardia. So, increase in the heart rate. Okay. So in order to avoid all these effects peripherally, we prevent the conversion of the levodopa to dopamine. Levodopa by itself does not cause any of these horrible effects. Okay, so it stays in the peripheral, it's not converted, that's fine. But then once the drug crosses the blood-brain barrier to the brain, that's when it's converted, right? Smart, isn't it? So let's show a figure. Okay. Okay, so what's going on in here? Which part shows the levodopa itself? Which part shows levodopa with carbidopa? This one is what? Levodopa by itself. So when you take levodopa by itself, it's everywhere. It's in the brain, it's in the peripheral, it affects everything, the heart, the vessels, everything. So you get, all these effects, okay? Now, when you combine levodopa with carbidopa, then levodopa is not gonna be converted to the dopamine, it's inhibited, okay? So you will have less, less of this red, let's say, horrible side effects outside the brain, but inside the brain, levodopa will be converted into the dopamine. So in which case would you need more of the levodopa and which case would you need less of the levodopa as a drug? In the combination, you will need what? Less, okay? Because, you have more control on the drug in the combination. But if you do not combine levodopa with carbidopa, you will have to give like 3 to 4 grams. You'll have to give I think it's like 10 or 100 times more of the levodopa, because many of the levodopa will be binding to the peripheral before you reach to the brain. Okay, so that's good. You reduce the side effect, you reduce the dose, and what else? Yes, ma'am, Melody.
Because that one shows all the going to the brain, it has smaller arrows.
Oh, as far as this part.
Whereas the right one doesn't have
Oh, that is confusing. I know, I would never draw a picture like that. Yes, I mean, thank you. So actually, right, it's hard to fix now, right? But I mean, do you get the point? You do? Really? No? Huh? Somebody wants to explain it? On the right picture, explain it on the right picture. Okay, so no, that's fine. No. Okay, I'm sorry for the confusion. I just assumed the thickness here of the red thing represents how much dopamine is affecting peripheral, but it's not true. So apparently, this thickness is actually whatever goes to the brain. Okay, so anyway, so right here we have only the dopamine, and then it's converted into, I'm sorry, levodopa, which is converted into dopamine, and then dopamine binds to these peripheral. Okay. And because of that, only few amount of the levodopa can reach the brain, so we'll have to give more of the levodopa. Okay. Here you have the carbidopa combined, so then you prevent the conversion of levodopa into dopamine, and since carbidopa does not cross the blood-brain barrier, it will only act on the peripheral. And then once the levodopa crosses the blood-brain barrier and reaches to the brain, then it's converted into the dopamine. So the levodopa is converted at the site where it needs to be working, which is in the brain. Outside, it's not converted because of the presence of carbidopa. Huh? Good? Yeah. Okay. All right. Can you raise your hand if you got this 100%? Or do this if not? Okay. Questions then? Yes. Say it again. What do you think? So what does carbidopa do? What does carbidopa do? Inhibits what? Okay, you can think of it as a metabolism, but it's okay. So it inhibits the conversion of levodopa, which is it active or inactive? Inactive. It inhibits the conversion of levodopa to dopamine. Okay, so when you combine these together, carbidopa and levodopa, then levodopa will not be converted to dopamine. So the drug will stay inactive. This is good for just for now, because the drug will not be causing any effects outside the brain. Now, both molecules, when they reach to the brain, which one will cross the blood-brain barrier, which one will not? Levodopa will cross the blood-brain barrier. It will get to the brain. What about carbidopa? Can it cross? Can it? It does not. So now, since levodopa is by itself in the brain, is it going to be converted or inhibited by carbidopa? Can carbidopa inhibit it inside the brain? No. So then levodopa will be converted inside the brain to the dopamine, and it will give the dopamine effects right where we want it to be, in the brain. And that's it. It's not gonna cause, so outside the brain, it's being inhibited by carbidopa. Okay? Make sense? Questions? Yes. So where is the enzyme AAD? The actually, yeah, the decarboxylase enzyme. Where is it present? Is it in the peripheral or in the brain? Both. Okay. Where does carbidopa inhibit the conversion of levodopa? Does it inhibit it in the peripheral or in the brain? Only the peripheral. Why? Because it's not able to cross the blood-brain barrier. Okay, if you have no questions, I'll move to the next one. Okay, so the next part talks about okay, so the next part, yes, John.
Just because I was afraid you were about to ask, where is the decarboxylase enzyme?
Yeah.
Rather than just simply peripheral or in the CNS.
Mhm.
Where is it? Is it just floating around in the blood? Is it on the neurons? Is it in the CSF?
I think it's just in the plasma and in the cell, fluids. So it's present everywhere, just like the estrays. No, I was just trying to express. Okay, so guys, so what are the problems with the use of levodopa and carbidopa? In the notes, have you seen something that talks about what happens after 5 years and the on-off effect of levodopa? What? Somebody wanna talk about this? Do I have any teams to compare, the I guess the problems with the use of levodopa, issues with levodopa compared to the other mechanisms? Okay, so do these medications stop the progression of Parkinson? No, right? They do not stop the progression of Parkinson. Okay? So they only treat the symptoms of Parkinson. We are giving dopamine just to help the person, survive. But eventually, the disease is actually progressive more and more, and we'll have more of these neurons being lost. Okay? So now, I want to give you a piece of information that will help you find why levodopa is a problem. So this decarboxylase enzyme is actually present inside these neurons. Okay? So when these neurons are damaged, you have no decarboxylase enzyme to convert levodopa into dopamine, or you have less of that enzyme. So now you have less of the drug. So after 5 years of using levodopa, we're having these on-off effects. On-off effects, okay? Which means that now the drug is actually not consistently within the therapeutic area, it's actually being drawn down the therapeutic area, and you get this Parkinson effects, the dyskinesia, or, muscle stiffness, okay? Also, levodopa has a short duration of action, so it's given more frequently, and the patient should be advised to take it on time, because if they miss, if they get behind in taking the drug on time, then you will again have the off effects. The drug will drop below therapeutic area, and then you will have these effects. Okay, so normally to deal with that, these drugs are designed into extended release formats. Okay, to help the drug stay better, and then you don't have to worry about administering drug more often. Okay, so 2 things: shorter duration of action, and this can be fixed by extended release formats. And then the second thing is, with time, these neurons are damaged, so you have less of the decarboxylase enzyme, so you're not able to convert levodopa into dopamine, and then you'll have to switch to another drug. Okay. plus the theory that says, dopamine by itself or administered levodopa, which is, converts it to dopamine. Dopamine is, neurotoxic, which, it's just a theory. We're not sure if this is really true or not. So this gives an advantage to other drugs like what? Monoamine oxidase inhibitors, okay? Because they do not rely on the decarboxylase, okay? And because, of the theory that says they are neuroprotective, okay? Yes.
So how would you know when to start using an MAOI?
Okay, this is really a clinical question. I think my guess is to start with levodopa and then within 5 years switch to the monoamine oxidase inhibitor. This is just my guess.
When you start the levodopa, it's already 80%.
Right. So I guess the 20% is still able to have enough decarboxylase, but then after 5 years, and for sure 15 years, but majority of patients after 5 years, they do not respond to the levodopa and they start having the on-off effects. Right, but to be honest, as far as which one goes first, this is more like a clinician question. My understanding is, you start with the levodopa, carbidopa, and then later on switch to the monoamine oxidase. But there's actually newer drugs that targets the dopamine 2 receptor. These are better drugs. So which one should be the best one to choose? This is more like a clinical question, okay? Sure, but again, the clinical studies show that it's just a theory. It's not been proved. Okay. Okay. So again, that's a good question. So which one do you start first, levodopa or the MAO inhibitors or the D2, D1 agonists? I'm sorry, but this is a clinical question. My guess would be levodopa first, and then monoamine oxidase. But then there are other newer generations that are probably better than both that they could be used. So as far as the protocol, you will learn about this from a clinician, okay? And it will depend on, the status of the disease and all that, all these factors. But you will learn about this later. And I'm sorry, sometimes I just cannot cover everything because it's hard, Yes, sir. Combination? Oh, at the same time? Okay. What did you read? Is that a guess or something you read? Okay. Okay. So Adishola had something to add. He says that that he looked at some video that shows that they start both, monoamine oxidase inhibitor and levodopa, carbidopa, together. So I mean that makes sense. Combination therapy always better than using one. And this way you could actually have less amount of both drugs. Remember, whenever you combine two drugs, instead of having the same amount of dose, then you actually would reduce both drugs and then you'll have less side effects of both. Okay, so we got the idea of what's the problem with the long-term use of levodopa, why after 5 years you get these on-off effects, okay? Because we do not have enough of the decarboxylase enzyme. That's it. So after these long time, 5 years, these enzymes, I guess, depleted, because the neurons are depleted as well. So you start getting these on-off effects. Okay? If you get this 100%, raise your hand. Excellent. Okay. Okay, the next part D of the exercise, talks about how did we find out that which conformation of the dopamine is the active form. Let me show you this first. So actually this table would help us answer this part. Okay, remember when we talked about the isomers that results from the rotation around a single bond? What did we call these? Stereoisomers, optical isomers, constitution isomers, conformation. So because of the rotation around this single bond, you have different conformational isomers. In fact, they are using the same term we use for the double bond, except it's, you know, trans beta rotamer. So beta is this bond here. Okay. So the trans and cis is just a way to refer to the two different conformations that results from the rotation around the single bond. Now, which one, how do we know which form is active? Well, first of all, why do we care which one is active? I mean, we have the dopamine, right? So why should we care about which form is active? Pharmacophore, if we know which form is active, I can design a drug that will be specifically similar to this form and nothing else, and be more selective, more specific, okay? So they have these experiments. This is a natural product, apomorphine, and they have this form, the R isomer of this natural product that was found to be less active. I know you guys cannot see, so I'm sorry. Okay, so this form here, this is natural product, this is another natural product. So they synthesize these two. One of them, if you look at here, mimics the trans. The other one mimics the cis. Do you see that? And since it is part of the ring, then it's fixed all the time here. It's not, you know, switching from cis to trans. The same with this one here. So now this one was found less active. This is inactive. And this one here was more potent. This is less potent. I think I'm missing something here. Moment of silence. Oh, I see what it is. Okay, so actually we have trans on the alpha, we have trans on the beta, we have cis on the alpha. Okay, so we have three different conformations. Can you guys see? Yeah. So we actually have three different conformations. Okay. These two look the same, except the OH here is actually switched. It's here instead of here. Okay. So anyway, three different conformations, and we are not sure which one is the active form. And like we said, if we know, we care about which one is active, because if we can tell which form is the active, we can design a drug that mimics only this active form and avoid other forms. Why is this important? Avoid side effects and selectivity, and have more selectivity. Okay, so anytime if we have a single bond that produces all these different conformations, if I know which conformation is the active form, and if I can fix the drug in this conformation in the active form, then that's good, because then I can be more selective and more sure that the drug will bind only to this receptor. Okay, we have talked about this when we looked at the acetylcholine different conformation. Remember, what are the two receptors the acetylcholine binds to? Muscarinic and nicotinic, and it binds to these two receptors through different conformations. Okay, so this drug has three different conformations. To find out which one is the active form, we designed three different molecules, and we fixed the drug into the conformation of each one of these three. This one was active, this is less active, this is inactive. And then again, another drug, or another way to test it, to test the potency, turns out to show that this is more potent than this. So guess what? Which conformation is the preferred one? This one here. Okay. So now, if I know that this is the conformation preferred, then when I design drugs, I will make sure to somehow fix the position of the nitrogen and oxygen to make the drug active and prevent any side effects. All right, questions? Or maybe I should have someone explain this again. I always like the way you guys explain things because it's much simpler and it's without accent for some of you. Okay, somebody is going to explain this again. It's like whenever I walk next to a table, everyone goes like. You can do it, come on. It's very simple. Everybody's looking at the shoulder. Come on, right. Go for it. I'll have no money at the end of the month. My wife is gonna kill me.
Okay, my understanding of this is that we wanted to know which of these isomers would is actually effective based on which one binds to the receptor the most and causes the expected therapeutic effect. And we have these three. We have the trans alpha rotamer, we have the trans beta rotamer, and the cis alpha rotamer. And if you look at the three, the pharmacophore of each of this isomer is such that we have the two OH groups for the trans alpha rotamer. We have the two OH groups on the left-hand side, and then the amine group on this other side. Same thing for the trans beta rotamer. The difference is just that the OH are now on a different side of it, but the cis one has a completely different position, thank you, to the amine group. Now, having in mind that the reason we have these different isomers is because it's easy for the OH groups to rotate. So we want to prevent that so we can be able to differentiate between each of this, among each of these isomers. So to do that, they designed a drug after each of the isomer. So a drug was designed after the trans such that it will not rotate. Another one was designed after the beta rotamer such that it will not rotate by fixing the configurations. And then the same thing was done with the third one. And so they now tested these three drugs based on the new the isomeric structures. They tested them and found out that the one that had the most activity, the one that bound the most to the receptor and then gave the best therapeutic effect was the drug that was designed after the trans alpha rotamer, and then followed by the trans beta rotamer, and then they realized that the cis alpha rotamer was inactive. And the only reason they could do this was because they fixed the structure, the pharmacophore, the 3D pharmacophore structures in the design drugs, and they tested them, and then they found out which one was active and which one was inactive.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Very elaborate explanation. And I see less confused faces now. How dare you? So I could not explain this well, huh? Okay. Should I take questions or move to the next one? Next one. Okay. So the next one should be much simpler, I hope. In fact, I'm just going to show the answers because it would make more sense. So how to fix the problems with bioavailability. So some of these drugs, the ergotamine and the apomorphine, they have bioavailability problems. We could not absorb them because they could not cross the gut wall, and they have short duration of action. So guess what? We can administer them as patches to solve both problems. So you will see patches that would extend, give the drug only small amount over the day. So you don't have to worry about giving the drug more often. And you bypass the metabolism, the first pass effect. Okay. And I think there's a picture in the note that shows one of these nice patches like this, okay? So you don't have to worry about the first pass effect by taking the drug orally, and you don't have to administer the drug more often, okay? In fact, there is another way which is called mini pump. So I think it's like an injection. You add it under the skin and it gives the drug, releases the drug over a long period of time. So just different ways of giving the drug in extended release form. What else? Okay. So before we move to exercise number 5, let me see if we have any questions about 4 or anything before that. Is that clear, guys? Should we move to the next one? Okay, so the next one talks about the selectivity. Apparently, there are 2 different enzymes of monoamine oxidase. Can you name them? A and B. Now, which one is the one that is responsible for the metabolism of the dopamine? B, okay? So first, if we provide a drug that is non-selective, it's gonna inhibit both, and then you're gonna have inhibition of, because you inhibit monoamine oxidase A, you have more side effects. One of these side effects is the hypotension. Hold on, I can't remember now. My memory is not helping me, I know. It's like type 1 Alzheimer's disease. Oh, it's called hypertensive crisis, okay? So if we inhibit monoamine oxidase A, we get side effects like hypertensive crisis. So we have some drugs that are non-selective, such as the phenelzine and the tranylcypromine, that would cause this effect, okay? In fact, these are not only non-selective, but they are irreversible. You know what that means? They stick to the enzyme forever. They do not leave the enzyme until the whole enzyme is tagged for destruction and new enzymes come up, okay? How long does this take? 14 days. 14 days. So you will see that when we talk about antidepressants next week, that one of the antidepressants are actually the monoamine oxidase inhibitors. And if you switch from a drug to another, if you are using the monoamine oxidase, then you have to switch, you have to wait for 14 days. It's not preferred, it's one of the non-preferred ways of treating antidepressants because of the side effects of the monoamine oxidase selectivity as well as the irreversibility. The drugs in the market in the US are irreversible. I know there are some outside the US that are reversible, but anyway, this is not preferred. Kevin, yes. Actually, I think it's from a different molecule. So the monoamine oxidase actually are involved in the metabolism of something, I can't remember its name. And then when you inhibit this enzyme, that something goes up and then it causes hypertension crisis, okay? And this something also comes from the cheese. So if you take monoamine oxidase inhibitor, you should avoid eating cheese, which is very bad, right? I mean, it's everywhere. So again, so because of the side effects, because of the restriction on the food, monoamine oxidase inhibitors, or the non-selective ones, are horrible, okay? Now, if you take the selective one, that's nice. You get less, I mean, you see, selectivity does not mean that you're 100% selective to the B. it's like maybe 90 versus 10. So you still get some of these side effects. So that's why monoamine oxidase are not preferred when you have other options. But if you have nothing but, you know, in the case of anti-Parkinson's, we don't have really many options. So, you know, Parkinson versus not eating cheese. So yeah. Okay. Okay, so this concludes today's lecture. So let me answer any questions you have about anything in today's lecture. I know you had a cat to study for, so I'm not sure, do you wanna, like, you wanna study, you wanna have a discussion? I know I wanted to like stay after class every time to answer your questions. I'm not sure what to do. Do you want me to stay here and answer the questions, or do you wanna study for your cat lab? Yes, Kevin. Which one? Adenosine receptors. Okay. Okay. So one of the other mechanisms we talked about, caffeine, right? So caffeine inhibits the it antagonizes the adenosine receptors A1 and 2. Okay, and these receptors oppose the action of D1 and D2 receptors. Let's see. So by antagonizing this adenosine receptor, then you actually enhance the dopamine. Okay, it's gray, it's not clear, right? But anyway, so adenosine receptors oppose the action of D1 and D2 receptors on gene expression. Okay, so by blocking, antagonizing this receptor, then you get more of the D1, D2 receptors. Okay, so some drugs act as antagonists on the A1, A2 receptors. Among these, caffeine acts as an antagonist on that. Okay. How about this? Why don't we, like, I stay here until 12, see if you have any questions about today's lecture, and then I'll leave, and then you could study for your cat. If you have more questions, you can follow me to my office. Works? Okay. At the same time, if you're like 100% confident, you just want to go and study, that's fine with me. Okay. So I'm going to stay here. If you have question, call me, and then I'll present it to everyone and share the question with everyone. Okay. Right. So I guess one question we had from Vivian was about the MO inhibitors. So again, this is the way dopamine is synthesized, metabolized, okay, by two different enzymes. If we block this enzyme, we'll have more of the dopamine. Notice that the MO enzyme is also here and here, okay? So if you block this pathway, then we'll have more of the dopamine. Now, the enzyme that metabolizes the dopamine, there are two kinds, A and B. In the case of dopamine, it's B is the one that metabolizes dopamine. So our goal is to design a drug that inhibits monoamine oxidase B, okay? So a selective drug. If we don't, then we'll have a drug that will inhibit both A and B, and then we'll have side effects from the inhibition of enzyme A.
Are you saying this is A?
Yes, but before I just remembered something. I finished class early today. Okay, so Vivian, does this answer your question? Okay, so we have the enzyme that metabolizes dopamine is monoamine oxidase B. Okay, so drugs that inhibit monoamine oxidase B can also inhibit A if they are non-selective. And then you will have side effects because of inhibiting monoamine oxidase A. Say it again. Right. So you wanna design a drug that is selective only for B. Okay. If you don't, it's gonna inhibit A and then you'll have side effects. Okay, now cheese is actually metabolized. One of the products of the cheese is metabolized by monoamine oxidase A, and then if you inhibit monoamine oxidase A, you'll have more of that product, and you get hypertensive crisis. So hypertensive crisis is very bad, and what's even worse is if you take any of these drugs, then you have to avoid, products that have cheese. So that's why monoamine oxidase inhibitors are not preferred unless they are really selective. Okay. You're welcome.
So you did mention some drugs, but there were some drugs you were talking about. So do we need to
Okay.
know any of those drugs?
Okay, so for example, these two, the phenelzine and the tranil cypramine, are non-selective. An example of selective one let's see, is this one here. The safinamide is actually a selective inhibitor for monoamine oxidase B, and it's actually reversible, which is a good thing. So you could stop the drug and then not worry about, This is, okay, yeah, page 18. Sure. Yes. Okay. You're welcome. Okay. Right. You guys have 2 or 3 minutes if you have any questions. Any questions? Okay. Well, good luck in your cat today, okay?